watching a few numbers still trickle in, so there'll likely be some more, but we're after 7 o'clock now, so we'll get things started. My name is Jordan Ignatiuk. I'm the Executive Director with Nature Saskatchewan. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the 2022 Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Branimir Gjetvaj, who will be presenting on why do we need nature-friendly agriculture. Before I introduce Branimir today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the numerous treaties across Saskatchewan, including 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. Saskatchewan is the ancestral home of the Plains Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, and Denisovanin people. Saskatchewan is also the traditional home of the Métis Nation. I would like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked this land for centuries. The conference organizer, Citizens Environmental Alliance, was created to address the issue of farmland drainage in Saskatchewan, and CEA has partnered with other like-minded organizations to bring you this conference. The Farmland Drainage and the Environment Conference series was initiated from the Farmland Drainage Roundtable Workshop in Saskatoon in June of 2018, where a wide range of interests and backgrounds, including farmers, environmentalists, Indigenous people, academia, local governments from throughout Saskatchewan came together. One main conclusion from this report was the need for education and communication to change perceptions surrounding the issue. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before the presentation. Everyone's mics are on mute. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to type them into the question or chat box functions on your dashboard as we go along. And it's with great pleasure tonight that I get to introduce our our speaker for this evening. Dr. Branimir Gjetvaj is a Saskatoon-based biologist, conservation, and environmental photographer. He holds a Master of Sustainable Environmental Management degree and a PhD and MSc in genetics. Branimir is a former president of Nature Saskatchewan, has served on the board of directors of several environmental NGOs, and as an appointed member to the University of Saskatchewan Senate. He's published 2 award-winning books on prairie conservation, The Great Sandhills, The Prairie Oasis, and The Islands of Grass. Branimir is interested in issues at the intersection of land use, biodiversity conservation, and food security. Through his involvement with the Prairie Food System Vision Network, Branimir is engaged in developing a visioning process to transform the Canadian prairie food system. As a Croatian Canadian, Branimir brings multicultural perspectives to nature conservation and reimagining these food systems. He is proud of his culture, heritage, and the ancestral connection with the land. Branimir, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. And hello, good evening, everybody. And I would like to thank organizers to give me the opportunity to give a presentation tonight. I cannot see any of the comments that you guys write, so we will keep questions and answers at the end of the presentation. And they'll be better not to interrupt the presentation flow, so don't press any wrong buttons. So without further ado, I will just go on and start with my presentation. Why do we need more nature-friendly agriculture? So today's special, it was actually, the title was a clickbait with a nature-friendly agriculture. I thought it'll be easier to explain and more accessible to people rather than trying to put a title ecosystem-friendly agriculture. Because today I'm not only going to talk about the wildlife and nature within the agricultural landscapes, I'm going to try to stress, and I hope you'll get that message, that I'm trying to talk about the ecosystem-friendly agriculture, or the agriculture that is taking advantage of ecosystem processes to help us have a secure and resilient food system. So a hip thing to talk these days is to talk about habitat conservation and restoration in connection with the climate change mitigation through nature-based solutions. And if you think about the nature-based solutions as actions to protect, manage, and restore forests, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon from the atmosphere. So we hear a lot about it, and right now, I kind of started giving presentations 2 years ago. That was interesting thing to do, an interesting thing to talk about. Fortunately, our federal government picked up on it and really put a lot of resources to use the nature and what nature can help us and provide us with mitigating the climate change. What I see in the research circles being talked about more and more is the connection between the habitat conservation restoration and food security. So agricultural production and how do we obtain food and fiber, and linking the food security and food systems with the nature-based solutions. So applying natural processes to strengthen our food systems. I see an important and very strong and powerful and research journals who publish critical research papers who deal with that topic. And hopefully in a few years, we will talk about this the way we talk about the climate change mitigation through nature-based solutions. So this is my kind of a promo talk to start thinking about it more and more in our conversations and our actions. So what are the challenges of the day? What do we need to deal with these days? We are quite familiar with threats that are brought in by the climate emergency and the ever-changing climate conditions and weather conditions. Critical issue that we have to deal with is a dramatic loss of biological diversity, and everybody is aware of pandemic diseases, especially now with the coronavirus and COVID-19. And a lot of these diseases are zoonotic diseases. They were brought in by biological vectors, and there's a lot of discussion and opinion that those diseases are spread into the human population through interaction with humans and encroachment into the natural habitats. So when you look at all of those factors and challenges of the day, what do they have in common? They have a land use. How do we deal and how we approach and how we treat land? And sometimes that treatment of land is not very happy and not very gentle. What you see here, the picture, is actually not a burning forest, rainforest in the Amazon. It is a burning of the aspen parkland in just north of Regina. So we are not treating the land very well. We have to stop degrading our natural landscapes, such as here example you see removing and burning aspen parklands and also to expand the agricultural land. Also considering this is agriculture drainage conference, I have to put a plug in about the wetlands too. We need to treat our wetlands much gentler than we have been treating it. Since European settlements in 1800s, it is estimated that approximately 20 million hectares of wetlands in Canada have been drained for agricultural purposes, and that the total loss in the settled areas is approximately 70% of historical levels. So how much deterioration of the Earth system is there? Scientists from the Stockholm-based Resilience Institute introduced the concept of planetary boundaries and a safe operating space for humanity. The planetary boundaries are intended to represent Earth system processes, which, if pushed over a certain limit, could generate unacceptable system changes. So what you see here, the inner circle is actually the zone of uncertainty, and the outer circle is a boundary zone of uncertainty. And if any system pushes beyond it, it would go into unstable state and kind of develop in a direction that we really cannot control, and we do not know what is going to happen. As you can see from the illustration, we have overstepped 4 out of 8 safe planetary boundaries, which is biodiversity loss, impacted mostly by the land use change and habitat loss. This is a nitrogen and phosphorus overload in the systems, land system change, and climate change. And agriculture has had a large role in all 4 stressors on the environmental systems. Hence my interest in ways how we can minimize that impact. Authors of the study on the concept warn that the existence of the world that we have known and benefited from now depends on our actions as planetary stewards. How do we treat the land and how do we treat Earth? So in 2019, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES for short, it is the organization parallel to much more popular IPCC, released the assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. This landmark IPBES report warns that nature and biosphere integrity are declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, with negative impacts on people around the world. This report also stressed that the need for a fundamental change how we interact with the natural environment. So the report brought forward the possibility that over 1 million species are facing a risk of extinctions. I just put one chart here that show the decline of North American birds, which you're quite familiar with. Their species declining in each biome since 1970s. And you see I don't know if you can see my mouse here, we see the change since 1970 in percentage, and the grassland birds are exhibiting the highest decline, both in the number and the proportion of species that are declining. So this is just one example, and up to 1 million species could face extinction if we do not do something. In the same year, 2019, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a special report on climate change and land with a warning that we have to fundamentally change how we manage the land, how we produce and consume food, and the substantially reduce food waste in order to minimize the effects of climate change. Although many people typically contribute greenhouse gas emissions to the energy sector, there are other important contributing activities such as the transportation and agriculture. The agriculture, forestry, and other land uses are responsible for about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. If you look more inclusively, global food systems, looking as a system as a whole that includes production, distribution, consumption, and waste, could be responsible for up to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. And here's a chart with greenhouse emissions for various economy sectors in Saskatchewan, and it's estimated that agriculture is responsible for about 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions, which is similar to other countries around the world. So why should we care? The Canada's Changing Climate Report that was released by the Environment and Climate Change Canada in 2019 paints a rather bleak picture. It reveals that since 1948, Canada's annual average temperature over land has warmed 1.7%, and that Canada is, on average, experienced warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. That warming will also intensify the severity and the heat waves and contribute to higher risk of drought and wildfires. As I've already mentioned, the agricultural practices are contributing to climate change, but also agricultural production is greatly impacted by the effect of climate change. We are quite aware last year we had this absolutely brutal drought with a reduced amount of rainfall that was dramatically lower than average. In addition to the swings and extreme heat episodes, more intense rainfalls will increase the flooding risks. And you see the picture of flooding in Maple Creek after a week of intense rains in June of 2010. One thing that we have to be concerned about, and also in terms of food security, the way how we receive moisture that we get rainfall in the spring and the snow melt, but majority of the rain is coming through during the summer is coming with the rivers, South and North Saskatchewan. Environment and Climate Change Canada report also predicts that under medium emission scenarios, glaciers in Canadian West and in the Rockies will lose between 74 and 96% of the volume by the end of the century, which will substantially impact on the availability of moisture that we receive in summer months by North and South Saskatchewan. So we are looking here at the two really critical factors, biodiversity decline, and that is impacting on the functioning and stability of the food systems. And then the climate impacts that are also having a strong influence on security and stability of our food systems. So how can we deal with the climate emergency? The primary focus on climate change mitigation is to reduce the energy, transportation, and agriculture sector greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the pink here, what you see on the graph right here, human carbon emission. This will require massive decarbonization through reduced use of fossil fuels and deployment of low carbon technologies between now and 2050. Our success to stabilize the global temperature depends on the increasing anthropogenic carbon sinks, so the sinks that are managed by humans, by transitioning our land use from carbon sources, which is red here in the graph that you see, gradually decreasing to major carbon sinks by the second half of the century. So what we see here is a kind of light blue and purple. Purple is a technological solutions, for example, carbon capture, and light blue is land use and land use change, where we, through forest management, restoration, or applicable agricultural practices, which will increase carbon capture and storage of carbon in the root systems, hopefully we will increase the amount of absorption of the carbon and storage in the soils. In terms of what you see on the green, the biosphere carbon sinks, they will proportionally shrunk as a greenhouse gas emission decrease over the next 100 years. So what are the most effective biosphere and human-managed carbon sinks? Nature-based solutions, I already mentioned that, provide immediate opportunity to harness the power of nature to mitigate and also to be more adapted to climate change. As I mentioned, nature-based solutions are actions to protect, manage, and restore forests, grasslands, wetlands, and agricultural lands that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and carbon storage. A recent study released just last year in fall 2021, no, that was a year before, no, 21, they show that the nature-based solutions have the potential to cut Canada's greenhouse emissions up to 11% of current levels by 2030. And what is also important, that the majority of nature-based solutions will effectively, if effectively implemented, they will also offer co-benefits like water filtration, flood buffering, soil health, biodiversity habitat, and enhanced climate resilience. As I mentioned, the Canadian federal government announced investment into climate-based solutions, and they promised to spend $3.8 billion in nature-based solutions over the next year, which will go into protection, improved management, and restoration. For example, plant 2 billion trees. Here is an example of the human-induced change in biological carbon storage through negative or undesirable land use changes, which we do need to eat food, but the way how we eat food and how we produce food, we could really minimize the impact. If you cultivate or previously untilled soils, which is, let's say, native grasslands or aspen parkland, that results in the average decrease in soil organic carbon by average of 13%. This is one study conducted by Dr. Edward Ward from University of Alberta that looked at the changes in soil organic carbon from converting native grasslands to cropland. And here you see that in the prairie region, there is an average drop of close to 30% in soil organic carbon from converting native grassland to cropland. In the parkland region is much higher because soils do have higher organic content, and I think they also included the above ground biomass and also the litter in the soils, right? So cultivation of previously untilled soils resulted in average decrease in soil organic carbon by 30%, and that's I also mentioned that in previous slide. And why the native grasslands are so important to capture carbon in the soil? When you see in the image before, there's a huge root system which really captured the carbon from the atmosphere and then deposit and store that carbon in above ground repository. The problem that we have recovering carbon that was lost by the last land use change in the range of ecosystem contain irrecoverable carbon that is susceptible to release upon land use conversion, and once lost, it is cannot be recovered on timescales relevant to avoid dangerous carbon impact. What you see here on the red basically just explain the graph. Let's say if we have an event with the land cover conversion, whether it's aspen parkland or a grassland into the cropland, we see a dramatic removal of the biomass, above ground biomass, let's say burning the aspen parkland, and then later in a certain time interval, when the recovery is initiated, we do see a fast recovery of that above ground biomass. Whether that biomass will be completely recovered, it's questionable. What do we grow on that land? Similar system is in the soil carbon, where we have this deep system where we have a stable soil carbon. It doesn't change. But then up to a certain depth, there is a carbon that is really susceptible to change, and we lose it by conversion, mostly in the first 5 years. that 30% loss. We do see if we grow crops, some of that carbon will be captured by plants, stored in the root system, and then we'll see that soil carbon recovery. However, it is quite rare that we have complete recovery of the carbon just if we use, for example, conventional agricultural practices. So when you hear the story about the magic of no-till farming and how they actually increase the amount of carbon in the soil, it is completely true. However, those studies started in a point after we lost this huge amount of carbon from natural systems, let's say from 1980s, looking to about 2016, 2019, where we actually starting to see that plateau of capturing carbon. So it is true, but some agricultural practices that are really promoted, like a no-till agriculture, will increase the carbon, but it will be increased from this point here to this point there. To come, hopefully, somewhere here, we have to do and apply more alternative agriculture practices that up to now we have not been practicing a lot, and we need to increase that. As I mentioned, as you saw from the graph, is the most efficient way to keep that biodiversity and soil carbon intact and store it both for food security and ability to have a stable food system, and also for the climate, is to maintain healthy and biodiverse grasslands and aspen parklands. Perennial grasslands, and particularly native non-cultivated areas, capture and store a large amount of carbon below ground, where it is relatively stable in the form of soil organic carbon, inorganic carbon, and litter on the surface of the soil. So I mentioned that already. What should be our priorities for the climate change mitigation and biodiversity protection? Protection of natural landscape is on top of the list. So the best and most effective action to mitigate the effect of climate change and biodiversity loss are in avoiding negative impacts, basically protecting what we have, minimizing unavoidable impacts, so properly managing the landscapes, and thirdly, remediate negative impacts by restoring the affected landscapes and what has been lost. What is really neat, it's really difficult as a photographer to find the areas where you can show this land use change. But I found this actually the newly converted field that used to be aspen parkland and the grazing land. And you can still see here the sign for the livestock grazing. So basically, this used to be a pasture, but now is being converted into the cropland. And you can see here actually the reason why we see such a huge loss of organic carbon, because when you till the soil and when you remove that basically living surface, living area with the plants and living root system, the soil and carbon in the soil is exposed to the air, it oxidizes, and we lose that carbon that used to be in organic and inorganic form in the soil. So disturbance, soil surface disturbance is really negative, quite detrimental. So the land use change, agriculture is considered to be the single largest driver of environmental change, and at the same time, it's also the most impacted by those changes. Through its impact on available habitat change, agriculture is the leading cause of biodiversity loss. This pressure may increase further if cropland expansion and intensification continues to the way that we have been approaching it. So we really have to think, how do we produce food and how that our actions are really having impact, both on biodiversity and on climate. I don't want to sound that I'm negative towards agriculture, because we need to eat, but we need to think how we produce and, more importantly, how we consume the food, and I will talk about that later. So what are some of the examples of land use change and surface changes? What do we see in agricultural landscapes? Natural features such as shelter belts and wetlands have been removed from agricultural landscapes at an alarming rate, with marginal increases in yields. There's a recent US study of annual land use change from 2008 to 2016, so 18-year period, that a look at the area study that the croplands have expanded at the rate of over 1 million acres per year. However, close to 70% of these new cropland areas produce yields below the national average, and the average reduction in the yield was 6.5%. So this expansion of agriculture into the previously non-crop areas will produce more food, but there is a question, if that new amount of produced food, what is the cost, both on wildlife, on biodiversity, and everything that nature is providing to us? What is the value? So the problem is that those nature contributions to people are really not properly valued, and we cannot really manage properly if we do not have economic assessment of what is being lost by converting those natural landscape into cropland. And I think later on in presentation this week, we will see one presentation of the economics of land use conversion later on. So what is driving this agricultural intensification? Over the past 70 years, we have witnessed increased crop production with even more sophisticated seed technologies and highly mechanized farming methods that employ fewer workers. These new technologies, both genetics and technology, have contributed to the farm productivity growth, which has in turn allowed North American farm output to rise without significant growth in the aggregate economic index of agriculture input use. And when I talk the aggregate input of aggregate agriculture input include total production, which includes labor, and we say that the fewer and fewer people working, higher machinery use, and higher use of pesticide and fertilizers, in addition to better technology, better farming practices, and also better genetics. However, is this increased production of an abundance of cheaper food really does not necessarily translate into healthier and nutritiously dense food? So, is abundant and cheaper food desirable? We are witnessing extensive food waste and rise in obesity, especially in North America and in developing countries. Globally, about 30 to 40% of the food is being wasted for various reasons, whether it's at the production stage or on consumption stage. There's a study that I found that in Canada, this food waste could be even higher, close to 50, or they say 50, 80%, which is pretty scary. In addition to this, basically a food waste, there are larger environmental costs of the agriculture intensification through conventional high input agriculture. In an effort to increase and maintain crop yields, agricultural production has rapidly intensified over the last 6 decades, relying heavily on agrochemicals, fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. On the prairies, fertilizers were applied on close to 80% of on 80% of the land. They applied herbicides, and 81% of the cropland area the fertilizer have been applied in the study period. There was a dramatic increase in the use of fungicides, 41%, insecticide, 50% between 1996 and 2016. So this dramatic increase in the use of agrochemicals does have a negative impact on the natural environment. In addition to this environmental impact, there are also economic and social costs of the conventional high input agriculture. What I show you, the graph here, is the gross farm revenue and realized net income with government subsidies subtracted for the period of 1926 to 2018, and all of the values are adjusted for inflation. So we'll look at the net farm income of high input and high output and high energy use agricultural production model. So when we're having ever increased quantities of fuel and agrochemicals, which cost money, lowers the total net income, the money that actually food producers actually earn and take home. So we look here in the blue chart here, are the input costs that are increasing over the years, and the farm receipts are actually relatively stable, going up or going down. What we see the difference is basically in green is farm income and profits, which in some periods over here marked in red were negative, and actually the farm subsidies kept the farming communities alive. And other activities, a lot of farmers were driving trucks or doing something else just to be able to support their farming. we need, what I want to say, we need to rethink our conventional high input agriculture. That North American approach contrasts sharply with North European strategy, which emphasizes using less land and other inputs in order to protect the environment. By achieving a comparable rate of agricultural productivity growth, or output growth minus the growth rate inputs, Northern Europe has been able to maintain its level of total farm output, what we see here, over the past 3 decades, but reduce the farm inputs. So the European Union began setting aside farmland to curb overproduction in late 1980s. So these programs, their programs focus heavily on environmental quality, and policy reforms in 2013 required farmers to allocate 5% of their land to protecting ecological focused areas. The goal was to generate long-term environmental benefits by prioritizing nature. So this program supports both food production and nature conservation that we are unfortunately lacking here. The idea and that concept and effort are lacking here in North America. We do have to rethink conventional high input agriculture, and a lot of members of the farming community are realizing they're basically running in circles like on a treadmill, where this increasing farming inputs are really not improving the bottom line. So we are seeing a larger and larger farms where basically an economy of the scale trying to generate more income with ever decreasing profitability. So a lot of people in farming communities are looking into an alternative farming system, basically to stay afloat and try to reduce the cost with ever increasing farming inputs, with chemicals, fuel use, and so on. Right? So we have to rethink the conventional high input agriculture, because we could face a serious challenge from a reduced resilience of this simplified agricultural system to rapidly changing environments. Formerly heterogeneous landscapes are becoming more and more uniform, with large areas of annual crops dominating over the greatly reduced and fragmented natural habitats of wetlands, woodlots, and native grasslands. So the problem we have is that the ability of high input, low diversity farming systems to withstand disturbance caused by the climate change and other factors could be diminished if we continue with the business as usual. We do need to increase diversification of both cropping system and also landscape features. We do need to increase the diversity on landscapes. So increased diversification of cropping systems and landscapes where the cropping system resides will enhance agroecosystem performance and system resilience. Application of agroecological farming system will increase the stability of the food system. It will reduce the amount of agrochemical inputs and improve farm profitability, in many cases without compromising yields. So by focusing more attention on species, especially functional diversity of ecosystems, for enhancing on-farm and landscape scale diversity, we should be able to design and manufacture agricultural landscape for better delivery of biodiverse-based ecosystem services, and at the same time increase stability of our food system. What I wanted to show you here is just a picture that I did kind of a study last year. I went back to Croatia and looked at in one farm field, actually agricultural land of the island of Hvar. That is quite intriguing. What you see here, maybe for Saskatchewan standards, is not very productive area, probably is the way how we approach agriculture. This would be bulldozed and maybe put more basically higher, in quote, efficiency agriculture system. However, the field that you see here has been producing food for over 3,000 years with applying diverse systems and agroecology practices. And what is really neat about this field is there are some areas that we know the names of the farmers who have been producing food, who produced food 2,400 years ago. So there is a system basically where they have these terraces to reduce the soil erosion, they have water retention systems, and they grow crops that are basically adjusted to the climate and adapted to the climate conditions. So when I talk about the diversified farming systems, they could promote multiple ecosystem services without compromising yield. There is a large review study in 2020 when they look over 5,000 original scientific papers, and they found that overall diversification enhanced biodiversity, enhanced pollination, pest control, nutrient cycling, soil fertility, water retention without compromising crop yield. So these are some of the factors that they looked at with the crop system diversification, and then non-crop diversification that is of special interest to me, and that is including landscape diversity that can include adding of boundary habitats, shelter beds and prairie strips, within and around fields or in the surrounding landscape. So actually, you can improve this as some chart here to see what are the relative effects of using this diversified agricultural practices here, right? So I won't go into detail, but basically, we could have increase or not a large loss in yields, but improve really ecosystem services that we receive from nature. So diversity inclusion in natural landscape, such as wetlands and prairie buffer strips, will help filter and reduce the seeping of agrochemicals into waterways. I found one Canadian study of 21 headwater streams located in southwest Manitoba. And the study found that the agricultural landscapes need more than 30 to 40% of natural habitat or natural features, what they call it, to reduce the discharge of dissolved organic matter and nutrients, predominantly phosphorus and nitrogen, into streams. And then here, just a quote, direct quote from the paper that said the presence of natural land cover is important for these reasons that you can read here. But what I want to point out here, the number, what I came up with, 30 to 40% of natural features in agricultural landscapes. And that number is going to be important later on, but the tree huggers like me will talk about. So do we need more biodiversity in agricultural landscape? And also, do we need more ecosystem-friendly agriculture? I would argue that the answer is yes, and very loudly yes. Maintaining and enhancing biodiversity within agriculture system may reduce the trade-offs between food production and ecosystem health and increase agroecosystem resilience in the face of global environmental change. So how do we get more biodiversity-based ecosystem services? One example is prairie strips along the field edges or road allowances to grow more natural plant cover. They both serve as a refuge for pollinators and pest controlling insects. So here is one study that found and determined that bee abundance and the number of bee species will consistently decline with decreases non-arable land cover. So what we see here in the picture, basically the agricultural land went as close as it could into this, in quote, non-arable cover. So if we decrease this non-arable cover adjacent to agricultural land, we will decrease the bee abundance and the number of beneficial insects, which will have a quite dramatic impact on our food security, because we know that the pollinators improve production of 70% of major wool crops. We studied a look at 124%. And they also influence 35% of the global food supply, right? One neat thing that is not that well known, did you know that if 40% of the pollination in pollinator-dependent species is done by insects other than bees, so various flies and other critters? This is why it's important to maintain natural features in agricultural landscapes. Again, I mentioned prairie strip shelter belts to provide refuge for these beneficial insects. So there is a growing understanding of the links between diversity and ecosystem function and services, or what some people call nature's contribution to people, rather than just function and services, which is a very technical term. And also the diversity increases resiliency of systems to disturbance. So improving biological and functional diversity, both on the farm and landscape levels, would greatly contribute to food system stability and climate risk reduction. So how do we deal with the loss of biological and functional diversity, or the loss of traits among various species? Because this is very important, because extinction of species with unique traits and their contribution to that total ecosystem function are likely to have more pronounced consequences than extinction of species with redundant or more common traits. So we do need that diversity. How do we protect biological diversity? So I will switch more now into the conservation part of the talk. Let's talk a little bit about the protected areas. So the area-based conservation approaches, such as the protected areas, are cornerstone for biodiversity conservation. So over the last 10 years, protected areas expanded from covering 14 to about 70% of global land and freshwater and environment. So besides strict protected areas, we also have other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECM, that can be run privately through non-government organizations and groups, for example, Nature Conservancy, community groups, or indigenous peoples, through the indigenous protected and conservation areas. OECMs have been overlooked in most national biodiversity policies and strategies. However, interest in OECMs is rapidly increasing, as they could help to address the shortfall in the strict area protected networks. So this is one example of strict protected area. It's a Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan. So these large protected areas are managed for the long-term conservation of nature. They provide suitable space for species that are susceptible to disturbance or habitat fragmentation. However, species populations within and outside of these protected areas, they do continue to decline. Even large parks and protected areas will continue to lose species over the long term if they're isolated from one another by unsuitable habitat. For example, a lot of migratory species use habitat that are outside of strictly protected areas for a large part of their life cycle. So what is the situation in Canada? What do we have right now? Is in Canada, by December 2020, we had about 13.5% of protected areas that include strict protected areas and OECMs. So 13.5% terrestrial and about 14% marine. In Saskatchewan, we had a 9.8% protected, and that is kind of came with a little bit of creative accounting, because it does include a large area of former PFRA community pastures, which right now, when they converted a switch to the provincial management, they're not managed for benefit of endangered and threatened species. So they're not really, in a sense, protected areas or OECMs. And basically the area of former PFRA pastures, excluding the 3 large pastures in the Southwest that are protected recently, reduced that number of protected areas. What is the goal? The federal government has a goal to increase that 13.5% to 25% by 2025. So this is the target. And 25% of terrestrial areas and 25% of marine area, with a goal and aspiration to increase that to 30% by 2030. What's happened in Saskatchewan? The target used to be 12%, and that was established in 1997, that was years ago, with a target date of 2000, and we accomplished about 9.8%, or 8.8% if you're more realistic. Going forward, I haven't heard any plans to increase that number. There is some rumor that government is looking forward to increase that, but I haven't heard anything official. So I will just hope that it will be hopefully closer to that goal that federal government and the rest of the world has been aiming for. What we have to think about and consider is that the focusing on a large protected area alone will not be sufficient without including conservation efforts to protect surrounding small, often isolated habitat patches. This is particularly important in heavily modified, human-dominated landscapes such as agricultural lands. So for biodiversity conservation to work, the effectiveness of protected areas is significantly influenced by the type of land management of surrounding land. So what we need to do, we need to think about a complex matrix of wildlife-friendly landscapes established through working land conservation, which will complement protected areas by providing necessary habitat for some species while assisting dispersal and adoption to climate change in others. So I just found a study done here in Alberta that looked at the effectiveness protected area, which is influenced by the habitat quality in those surrounding landscapes. And what is the situation of the wildlife habitat capacity on those surrounding landscapes, especially agricultural land? Not very good picture. Here, just a status of wildlife habitat capacity on agri land in 2017, where the capacity is measured as the ability of the landscape to support breeding and feeding for wild terrestrial vertebrates. Goes from good in green to bad in red. And if we kind of look at the Saskatchewan here, it's almost all red, and large part of southern Manitoba is very red. Alberta is doing a little bit better. So we do need not only protect more protected areas, but we also need to improve the habitat in those boundary habitats and shared lands. I'm getting close to the end here. World leaders have responded to the call for the global deal for nature and pledged to increase the global protected area targets from 70%, and that was the HE target 11, the goal was set for 2020. So the new goals and aspirations are 30% protected areas by 2030 toward the ultimate goal of 50% protected areas by 2050. So how that can be accomplished? One conservation framework proposes a baseline of three broad land use conditions, which include cities and farms, large wilderness areas, protect about 26-27%, and then shared lands between humans and nature. So this proportion of total land area change with conditions of land use. One example of that shared land is the that both benefit food production and nature are shelter belts and prairie strips grown on those so-called shared lands. And those habitats not only provide benefit to wildlife, but also provide benefit to the food system, food production, through soil stabilization, water flow and quality, local increase in crop yields. That close to those features, we do see increase in crop yields. And then we have a soil organic carbon balance, climate control, cooling effect with a tree evapotranspiration and wetland cooling effect, right? So these are one example of those shared lands. So how can this 30 by 30 goal be accomplished without sacrificing food security? Because if we really include protected areas and generate and create them on areas were used for producing food, we will reduce food security and human well-being. So there is just a graph that will not go into detail, where depending on the land type, that ratio of cities and farms and strictly large wilderness areas will depend on the country and also will depend on the type of the land use. For example, in agriculture food production, we may not have large wilderness areas, but we'll have and we should aim to have some percentage of that land share, which includes wildlife-friendly farming, right? Because we need to balance the need for biodiversity protection and also producing food. Because of the sheer amount of land devoted to food production, conserving biodiversity, 30% of natural reserves and protected areas alone will not be enough. We need to supplement and support these area-based conservation measures by restoring degraded landscape in our agricultural lands, where more sustainable land management will be conducted across the remaining 70% of landscapes. So in the coming decades, we need to focus on conserving at least 30% of the land in protected areas, OICMs, and indigenous protected conserved areas, taking into consideration, and that is very important, we have to take into consideration the right of indigenous peoples and local communities. These lands will be managed in ways to support biodiversity and associated ecosystem function, and where applicable cultural, spiritual, and socioeconomic values are being conserved for future generations. So the key point of my presentation here is that in addition to creating more protected areas, we need to consider designing agricultural landscape as a mosaic of land uses that will consist of agroecology-based farmland, wildlife-friendly working lands, and protected area networks at various spatial scales. So given the evidence that intensified conventional agricultural systems are providing minimal key services beyond provisioning, basically providing food, but not much in, let's say, climate change, water filtration, and so on, future agricultural landscapes will need to be designed to support biodiversity and ecosystem function to secure agricultural system resilience, human health, and food security. So here's one quote that I found from the research of the work and the developing basically food system stability and going towards sustainability goals, saying that it's a time to move beyond a quest for sustainable land uses, which are actually, we are trying to minimize the impact of our action on the landscapes. We have to think about achieving sustainability through land uses. So what we need to do, planning how we are going to use our land for various uses and needs, and by using the land, how we will achieve sustainability. So what is the way forward? We need to reimagine the food system and integrate food production with biodiversity conservation beyond strict protected areas. How we can do that? 3 ways. We have to work on the demand side interventions where we have more sustainable consumption. We need to reduce the pressure on land by changing our food consumption. And I already mentioned, reduce food waste and also adjust our dietary patterns where we have more plant-based diets, because by more plant-based diets, we will have less pressure on the ecosystem. Here I have to put a large caveat on our, especially in supporting our prairie systems. I'm not saying stop eating beef or stop eating meat, because we have a characteristic of the landscape here that developed in basically with the presence of large herbivores, bison, that we will remove from the landscape and replace it with cattle, which have a similar ecological function with the as a bison. So we do need cattle, we do need cows to help us manage those grassland landscapes. It is true that eating chicken is less environmental damaging, less water use, less food use, better conversion. However, if you have ever tried to herd a flock of chickens and using them to manage the rangeland, then you will understand we do need to, both for ecological and social needs, support some of the ways of producing food which develop with the systems that we have here. We need to work on the supply side with more sustainable production, where we adopt more nature-friendly farming practices and improve on-farm and supply chain efficiencies. And that includes using more agroforestry and agroecological methods in farming systems. And also, we also have implement more alternate agriculture, including regenerative or restorative farming and ranching practices and organic farming. And then as a conservationist, the third one very dear to me, we do need to set aside more land for nature with more protected areas, whether that is strict protected areas, OECM, or IPCAs, which are indigenous protected conserved areas. And also we need to increase the amount of land shared between wildlife and food production. So that will be the end of my talk, if there are any questions.
Thanks, Branimir, for a great thought-provoking presentation. We do have some questions that have come in, and there will be time if people want to still continue to enter them into the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can be unmuted for the question. First one we have for you is, do the estimates of emissions for agriculture take into account carbon released from land conversion? So i.e. the wetland and grassland losses?
Yes. If you see a lot of the studies that you see, like Canada has to provide report to the international bodies how much greenhouse gas emissions we produce and release in a certain activities. And those numbers, usually you'll see 8 to 9%. So these are the strict kind of agriculture activities. That does not include fertilizer production, which uses a lot of nitrogen and ammonia. It's very energy intensive. And also it does not include land use change. It is a little bit tricky because the accounting includes agriculture, forestry, and other land uses together. So trying to parse those strict agriculture activity and land use change, it is a little bit tricky. I tried to do it myself. I was not able to, but people in the know calculated that 20%, 24% does include land use changes and other factors. Sometimes when you look at the food system as a whole, that includes food consumption, transportation, food waste, some people came up to like 35% greenhouse gas emissions from food systems themselves. So that's the variation from 9% to 35% what you include in those calculations. I hope that answers.
Okay, great, thanks. And would you say that higher input costs are being offset by higher crop prices, or are farmers making less money today despite spending more money?
Well, if I read from smart people, I would say farmers are making less money because those inputs really overcome any increases in crop values. And that includes fertilizer, pesticides, seed, machinery. Look at the machinery that the people are using right now, like combines and tractors. They're like millions of dollars value. What is happening, why we see the changes in agriculture practices is that to overcome that reduce in the income and profitability, farms are becoming larger and larger. So to increase the income, actually they're working with the economies of scale to generate enough income to be viable. So I would say yes, the increasing in inputs is what has a quite important factor in this decision making, whether people will be more kind of a nature friendly and using ecological processes to try to reduce that amount of input. So if you have, for example, if you do a multi-cropping, or if you have a prairie strips and you try to reduce the amount of insects or pests that you're really not desirable in your crops by having a help from predatory insects that come with these natural areas around your crops, then you do not need to spray them. Right? So I hear the stories from people in the north, for example, in Asper Parkland, when they do have this varying habitat, they use way less insecticides that the farmers who work in a more uniform and more monoculture type of agriculture production, that they have to use more insecticides. And those outbreaks are much stronger.
How would you propose landowners be compensated for protecting ecosystems?
Okay. I have opinion about that, but I'm not very sure if I agree with it. We do need to support really farmers who do a good practices and they try. Like when you see the farmers, there's a group that they try to do their best. They understand that those alternative agriculture practices are beneficial for the environment and for their bottom line. Then you have a group, they're on the borderline because farmers are really kind of reluctant bunch. They are reluctant to try something new because the margin of error is very small. If you screwed up something, the cost and paid, like the negative effect to you could be pretty detrimental. So they are really on the borderline, afraid to try something new and something different, to jump off the treadmill. And then you have a third group that they're not going to do anything. They're continue doing what they've been doing, what people telling them is like, forget about the environment, I want to make money. So we are not going to reach those people. We have to work with these people on the fence and support them to change the practices, because basically it costs them. If you have a cleaner water system because of particular agriculture practice, farmer doesn't have a lot of benefit to it. But a farmer or a communities, non-farming communities downstream really benefit from having clean water, not being contaminated by the nutrients, whether it's a nitrogen, phosphorus, or fungicides or insecticide. So that benefit has to be converted back to the producer. So I do think that some benefits, some carrots need to be in the system. However, there are cases where those programs for payment for ecosystem services, as soon as they stop, producers revert to what they were doing before. We see that a lot in the States with the end of the conservation conservation reserve program, where a lot of the land that the government was paying to be taken out of the production and seeded into perennial cover we do see now with the interruption of the payments, large portion of that land is being converted in agriculture. There is a field south of Indian Head where I saw a big sign. It says this field has been seeded into perennial cover thanks to the green cover program. And when you look at the field behind the sign, it's canola because the funding was interrupted. There's no more. So producers went back because they have to make money somehow. So I'm really torn. Do you really apply carrot or do you really apply stick? What I think what should be done is agriculture relies a lot on subsidies. If we put conditions on the subsidies and insurance, for example, I really don't see any logic that a farmer would, a producer would drain, either there's flooded in the spring, they apply for the flood damage, they drain the wetland, and then the same season when there is a drought, now in the drought situation, and then applied for the drought relief, right? That does not make any sense. There is a program, for example, in the Salt Saver in the States, where they actually, those, I don't know whether the payment premium or payouts were reduced if was determined that the producer on their land either drained the wetland or converted the grassland, right? So that benefit that was paid out to the producer was reduced by a certain level if they are applying practices that were not beneficial to the wider community. I think that would be more fair because then the farmer should decide, and what is the cost benefit analysis? Do I really convert this land or do I really, and then wait for the insurance premiums if something bad happens? Or do I try to keep it diverse and increase my chance that my farming system will be more resilient and I do not need to rely to support services? So yes, I do not know what is the correct answer to the question, but it's very complex. Do you pay for the ecosystem services or not? In a nutshell, I think we have to apply both carrot and the stick, but we do need to support farmers who are interested in applying beneficial practices that maybe don't benefit them. They do benefit because they increase their productivity and reduce the risk, but they also reduce the cost to the society. Just think about when we are talking about the farmer drainage, the government of Manitoba threatened to sue the government of Saskatchewan for illegal drainage because they had millions of dollars in damage because they're downstream. That was not their fault. That was people upstream pushing all the water down. So, I mean, there is really, we have to think about the system as a whole, right? Look in your pocket, put your hand in your pocket and tell me, do you find $1.7 billion in your pocket? Probably not, because that's the amount of money that the government took out of your pocket and paid to the oil and gas companies to restore and clean up all the oil and gas wells, right? So that we have to rethink that private profit and then society cost. Who is paying for it? It's a really complex issue, and I don't know how would I answer the question. So,
yeah, not everybody would agree on one principle of it.
Yeah,
we've got the time for just a couple more questions. Have agriculture groups accepted and advocated for the paradigm shift?
You mean a paradigm shift in basically trying alternative agricultural practices?
I would assume that, yeah, they're just getting sort of the name from within the presentation itself. Yes.
Yeah, yes, I would say yes. We see more and more that there are a lot of groups that are, for example, as it's really interesting. As I said, I'm a, well, not tree hugger, I'm a grass hugger. But I did join the Regeneration Canada and the groups, they're trying to see the farmers who are trying to do different alternative methods and trying to do things differently and trying to learn new things. We have very strong groups. It is Farmers for Climate Solutions, right? So you have a very strong group that are trying to do agriculture practices that would work towards minimizing the effects of agriculture and climate change, and also mitigating the effect of climate change through positive agriculture practices, cover crops, intercropping, changing how they work the land, right? So we see more and more people that are thinking about it and also working towards that goals. And I think we should be supporting those farming groups that are thinking positive. So there is hope. There is still resistance because there's a lot of what they call this perverse incentives that actually the government is by support system actually promoting negative and practices that are not very beneficial. So we really need to work in the policy system. What do we reward and what do we say in quote punish?
I think you've sort of answered this next one where, what's the best approach to bring about change, and then question policy, which I think you've just sort of said that we need to bring.
Yes, there's a policy. It's really interesting. I've been following, there's a group, World Wildlife Fund in the States. They have been working on actually conservation through food systems. And basically their goal is work with the best and then the rest will follow. So supporting food producers or members of the food system, participants in the food system, who are practicing positive approach to food production. So policy, I think the policy change is very important because I am trained as a scientist and we have a lot of knowledge. How do we apply the knowledge in making decisions what is going to be beneficial for the society? That is really the crucial issue. We do have knowledge, we just need to decide how we are going to apply that knowledge that benefits the society, not small number of individuals.
Okay, I think I've got one more here. Nothing else has been coming in. What needs to be done to address evolution towards corporate farms?
I don't know. That's a question I don't want to touch. Yeah, it's, as I said, I'm a grass hugger, not the economist or policy analyst. I don't want to go there. We do need support small producers, definitely. Because what I look at the studies that the small, actually globally, smaller farms and more diverse farms are more productive. They are beneficial for the biodiversity. However, there is, in terms of total income, they're not as productive as large corporate farms. The trick is that productivity and that income in large corporate farms, and that's that example that I mentioned with the oil companies, they do generate profit. However, when it comes to paying the bills, to cleaning up the mess, the society is paying it, right? So that's really, as a society, we have to decide why are we allowing that to happen. And it's very similar with agriculture. Support the producers who I wish are more diverse and maybe smaller producers, because smaller farms would allow more diversity of the landscapes and more inclusion of those boundary habitats, which are so beneficial for biodiversity and also beneficial for resilience of the farming systems, right? So I don't want to answer question how to prevent corporate farming, because I'm not expert in the area, but I've got my opinion, I've got my feeling, but I don't want to go there.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Branimir, and thanks to everyone who joined us this evening. You can find out more information about farmland drainage and what you can do at the Citizens Environment Alliance Facebook page. You can find the recordings from this conference and any other ones previous on the CEA YouTube channel. And if you're interested in reading the Insightrix report, you can find that on the Saskatchewan Environmental Society website. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining to the Farmland Drainage and Environment Conference. Thanks to all the sponsors, supporters that helped put it on. And tomorrow there will be another